The crowd was buzzing that morning, but not with the excitement that usually surrounds the Invictus Games. In the early hours, news vans lined the streets outside the game's headquarters, camera crews jockeying for position, and reporters clutching notepads and microphones as though a war was about to break out. Something monumental had happened, something that had shattered the carefully polished image of the games, and, more shockingly, the man who had been its face and voice since day one. This wasn't a sporting scandal. This was the kind of revelation that could topple reputations, alter legacies, and leave the public wondering how they could have been fooled for so long. For years, Prince Harry had been the embodiment of Invictus, smiling in photo ops with wounded veterans, delivering speeches about resilience, and presenting himself as the unwavering champion of those who had given so much for their countries. He had been the prince with a purpose, a royal who had stepped beyond palace walls to make a difference in the lives of others. But that morning, the headlines told a story that was as jarring as it was unbelievable. The very man who had built the games from the ground up was now accused of siphoning millions from its coffers into secret offshore accounts, hidden under the deceptive label of event consultancy fees. Worse still, the financial records proving it had come directly from Dominic Reed OB, the CEO of Invictus Games, and a man once considered Harry's most loyal ally. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. At first glance, the allegations seemed unthinkable. This was a charity built on the blood, sweat, and tears of those who had faced unimaginable adversity, men and women who had lost limbs, endured psychological trauma, and yet found a second wind through the games. The idea that the donations meant to fund their rehabilitation, their training, their futures, had instead been funneled into the personal accounts of the charity's royal founder was beyond scandal. It was betrayal in its purest form. And yet, the records were there. Dates, amounts, transfers, the names of shell companies scattered across tax havens. And at the center of it all, Prince Harry. The first sparks of this firestorm were lit weeks before, when rumors began circulating among insiders that there were irregularities in the game's finances. Most people dismissed it as idle gossip. After all, the Invictus Games had been a model of inspiration since its inception in 2014, and Harry had always seemed above the sort of petty greed that plagued other public figures. But Dominic Reed had seen the numbers himself. Quietly, without alerting Harry, he'd begun a meticulous review. At first, it was just small anomalies. Consultancy fees paid to unfamiliar entities, transactions processed outside normal reporting channels. But the deeper he dug, the more those anomalies grew into glaring red flags. That morning's press conference was not an impulsive act of vengeance. Reed had spent months compiling a dossier thick enough to make even the most jaded investigators take notice. When he finally stepped up to the podium, the tension in the room was suffocating. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. In a calm, measured tone, he laid out the trail of money, the forged signatures, the shadow companies, and the unmistakable evidence that linked each transaction to Harry's personal financial empire. Every word he spoke tightened the noose around the Duke's neck. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Social media lit up within minutes. The hashtags #InvictusBetrayal and #HarryScandal were trending globally before lunch. Veterans who had once praised Harry as their champion posted videos in disbelief, some in tears, others in anger. One former participant, a double amputee from Afghanistan, said on live television, "We trusted him with our stories, our struggles, our hope. And now I find out that while we were training in borrowed facilities, he was pocketing money meant for us." The weight of those words hit harder than any headline ever could. Behind the scenes, the machinery of legal accountability was already grinding into motion. UK charity regulators launched an immediate inquiry, while international watchdogs began tracing the offshore accounts. Journalists scrambled to secure copies of Reed's financial records, poring over every line in search of the smoking gun. And there was plenty to find. Large, round-number transfers with no legitimate invoices, payments routed through multiple jurisdictions in under 24 hours, and consultancy firms registered to addresses that didn't exist. Each discovery chipped away at the possibility of this being a misunderstanding. But perhaps the most shocking moment of all came just hours after Reed's revelations, when plainclothes officers were seen entering a secure royal property. Within minutes, Prince Harry was escorted into a waiting vehicle, the cameras catching a brief glimpse of his face. Tight-lipped, eyes hidden behind sunglasses, jaw clenched in a way that spoke volumes. It was an image that would be replayed on every news channel for days. The once beloved prince now reduced to a suspect in a global financial scandal. In the days that followed, the public was left grappling with a question that had no easy answer. How could someone who had stood as a symbol of honor and sacrifice commit an act so selfish and destructive? Was this the result of years of privilege eroding moral boundaries? Was it desperation for wealth in a life increasingly distanced from royal funding? Or was it something darker, a calculated decision made in cold blood, believing that the shield of his royal title would protect him from consequence? The truth, as it would soon emerge, was layered and ugly. But before that truth could be fully understood, the stage had to be set. This was not just the story of a financial crime. It was the unraveling of an image, the collapse of a narrative carefully crafted over nearly a decade, and the devastating ripple effects it had on those who had believed in it the most. It was about trust, how it is earned, how it is nurtured, and how, in one catastrophic moment, it can be shattered beyond repair. And so, as the world waited for the full details, one thing was certain. This was no longer about just the Invictus Games or Prince Harry. This was about the dangerous intersection of power, money, and public trust, and what happens when those at the helm forget who they're meant to serve. As the sun rose higher over London, the story took on a life of its own. Every major outlet was broadcasting variations of the same shocking revelation. Prince Harry, a man celebrated for his charitable work, allegedly redirected donations meant to support wounded veterans into his personal offshore accounts. Analysts and commentators began dissecting the financial records leaked by Dominic Reed, pointing out the scale of the alleged misappropriation. Millions of pounds, meticulously labeled under seemingly legitimate event consultancy fees, had vanished from the charity's books. Every detail seemed to suggest a level of planning and intentionality that shocked even those who had grown skeptical of royal excesses over the years. In homes across the globe, viewers struggled to reconcile two images. The public Harry, clad in smart blazers and soft smiles, celebrating triumphs with amputee athletes and wounded service members, and the private individual, now portrayed as orchestrating a complex financial deception. Conversations at dinner tables, in offices, and on social media platforms turned heated. How could he? Became a universal question. Some defended him, suggesting mistakes could be made in large organizations. Others were unflinching, convinced that this betrayal was deliberate and that the veneer of goodwill had been nothing more than a carefully crafted mask. Meanwhile, inside the legal and financial labyrinth, Dominic Reed's role became pivotal. As CEO, he had not only unearthed the discrepancies, but had also taken painstaking steps to ensure that the evidence could withstand scrutiny. Emails, transaction records, and internal memos formed a trail that investigators could follow. Experts in forensic accounting were brought in to verify the findings, confirming that the transfers were neither accidental nor easily explainable. Even seasoned auditors found themselves taken aback by the layers of complexity. Offshore accounts were disguised through a network of intermediary companies spread across multiple jurisdictions, a tactic often used by financial professionals seeking to obscure the true recipient of funds. But in this case, each thread pointed unmistakably to Harry. The emotional toll on the veterans associated with Invictus Games was perhaps the most compelling dimension of the unfolding story. For years, these men and women had shared their personal struggles with Harry, trusting that the charity he championed would honor their resilience with tangible support. For some, the betrayal felt deeply personal. One decorated soldier, who had lost both legs during his service, expressed his disbelief in a raw video clip that circulated widely. "We gave him our stories, our trust, our very lives in a sense. And now, knowing that he might have taken what was meant for us, it's like a punch to the gut we never saw coming." His words resonated with families, supporters, and even casual observers, reminding the public that the scandal was not merely about money. It was about broken trust and ethical responsibility. In addition to the personal and emotional fallout, the media scrutiny became relentless. Every public appearance by Harry was dissected, analyzed, and broadcast in real time. Pundits debated the implications of the alleged financial misconduct, speculating on the impact it could have on both the royal family and the Invictus Games' future. Some commentators drew parallels to other high-profile financial scandals, comparing the intricate schemes and public deception to infamous corporate frauds. Others focused on the human element, discussing the moral implications and the potential damage to Harry's reputation as a royal and a humanitarian figure. Yet, amidst the swirling controversy, a pattern began to emerge, one that suggested a broader narrative beyond mere greed. Investigative journalists noted that the misappropriations coincided with a period when Harry's personal expenses had reportedly increased significantly, from high-profile security arrangements to private residences and luxury travel. Was this a case of someone overreaching, of entitlement fueled by access and opportunity? Or was it a deliberate exploitation of the public's trust and the charity's goodwill? Each theory seemed to raise more questions than it answered, feeding a cycle of intrigue that captivated audiences worldwide. The public's fascination was not limited to the alleged financial crimes. Behind the scenes, royal insiders began leaking details that painted a picture of tension and uncertainty. Advisors who once worked closely with Harry reportedly struggled to reconcile his public persona with the emerging evidence of misconduct. Statements released by the palace were carefully worded, emphasizing the need for due process while distancing the institution from direct involvement. This created a layered narrative in which Harry's personal actions became inseparable from his public and royal identities, forcing the world to consider the responsibilities that come with influence and privilege. The combination of legal, financial, and emotional complexities ensured that the story could not be consumed passively. Audiences were drawn in, compelled to understand the motivations behind the alleged actions, the mechanics of the financial operations, and the impact on the very people Harry had claimed to serve. Each revelation acted like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples that touched every corner of public consciousness, from social media debates to international news coverage. The tension was tangible, as if the world collectively held its breath, waiting for the next twist or disclosure that might alter the perception of events. This introduction also needed to establish the stakes. What was at risk if the allegations proved true? For the Invictus Games, the potential collapse of donor confidence could threaten future events and programs designed to assist veterans. For Harry, the consequences extended beyond legal ramifications. They reached into the heart of his legacy, threatening to redefine decades of public perception in a matter of weeks. And for the public, particularly those who had admired or supported him, the situation became a deeply personal confrontation with disappointment, disbelief, and anger. As the day wore on, the narrative grew even more complicated. Leaks from within financial institutions revealed that some of the offshore accounts had been set up years before the scandal broke, suggesting premeditation rather than impulsive mismanagement. Legal experts speculated that this could constitute multiple counts of financial fraud, money laundering, and breach of fiduciary duty. Social commentators debated whether Harry's royal status would offer any protection, or if the weight of evidence would finally hold him accountable, regardless of title. By late afternoon, the human dimension of the story began to dominate the coverage. Interviews with staff who had worked directly with Harry on Invictus projects revealed a pattern of secrecy and gatekeeping. Several employees noted that Harry had personally insisted on maintaining control over financial decisions, often overriding standard protocols and discouraging transparency. These accounts, when combined with the hard financial evidence, painted a portrait of a leader who, according to some insiders, allowed personal gain to infiltrate a space that had once been purely about service. The juxtaposition of benevolent public gestures and alleged private misdeeds created a tension that audiences found impossible to ignore. The introduction to this story, even before the first chapter fully unfolded, was already a narrative in itself, a mix of betrayal, intrigue, and high-stakes drama. It set the tone for an exploration of morality, responsibility, and consequence, showing that beneath the surface of prestige and pageantry, even those who appear untouchable can falter in ways that shake the very foundations of trust. And as the public absorbed the first wave of revelations, the anticipation for the next chapter grew. Would there be denials, confessions, or further shocking disclosures? How would the legal proceedings unfold? And, perhaps most importantly, what did this mean for the thousands of people whose lives were intertwined with the Invictus Games? At this point, the introduction had fully set the stage. The world was watching, waiting, and questioning. The tension was palpable, the stakes were monumental, and the story promised to reveal more than just financial wrongdoing. It promised a deep dive into character, privilege, and the consequences of choices made behind closed doors. Every thread of this narrative would unravel with both emotional depth and factual precision, keeping viewers engaged, provoked, and captivated from start to finish. When Prince Harry first announced the creation of the Invictus Games, the world watched with admiration. Here was a young royal, scarred by personal loss and military service, stepping forward with a vision to celebrate resilience, determination, and the human spirit. The very name, Invictus, meaning unconquered, captured the ethos of the event. A global gathering where wounded, injured, or sick servicemen and women could demonstrate their courage through sports. The narrative was compelling, one that combined royal prestige with tangible humanitarian impact. Crowds cheered, veterans smiled, and the media hailed Harry as a modern, compassionate leader who could use privilege for good. From the outset, Harry positioned himself as a hands-on leader. He was not content to simply appear at opening ceremonies or make ceremonial speeches. Instead, he immersed himself in the logistics of the games, meeting athletes, understanding the physical and emotional challenges they faced, and shaping the event to meet their unique needs. His charisma, coupled with his military background, made him instantly relatable to the participants. Photos of Harry high-fiving wounded veterans, encouraging amputee runners, and sharing moments of genuine laughter and empathy went viral. The media portrayed him as both empathetic and proactive, a royal who was breaking the mold by being visibly engaged in meaningful humanitarian work. Fundraising quickly became a cornerstone of the game's expansion. Donations poured in from governments, corporations, and private individuals, all eager to contribute to a cause that promised to honor the sacrifices of servicemen and women. High-profile events, gala dinners, and charity auctions became vehicles for raising millions, and Harry's star power ensured that the Invictus Games attracted attention far beyond traditional philanthropic circles. Sponsors were thrilled by the association with a royal figure who embodied courage and service. The narrative was flawless. The public loved the personal stories of the athletes admired Harry's dedication, and the donations fueled a seemingly unstoppable cycle of charitable success. Yet, beneath the surface of acclaim, there were signs of complexity and vulnerability that only insiders could perceive. Managing an international charity of this scale required a meticulous approach to finances, governance, and transparency. Each year, billions of pounds flowed into various accounts to cover everything from stadium rentals and adaptive sports equipment to travel and lodging for participants. The sheer volume of money and the international reach of the organization demanded rigorous oversight. Board meetings, audits, and internal controls were essential components of responsible management. Yet, for someone with Harry's dual identity, both royal figure and operational head, the balance between personal authority and organizational accountability was delicate. Initially, the financial operations appeared smooth. Donations were allocated to programs, grants were distributed to support athletes' rehabilitation, and media coverage consistently highlighted success stories. Yet, insiders noted that Harry often maintained extraordinary control over financial decisions, bypassing standard protocols in ways that were initially overlooked because of his high-profile status. Requests for documentation, routine checks, or cross-verification were sometimes delayed or informally addressed. Observers initially chalked this up to a hands-on leadership style, assuming that his intentions were aligned with the charity's mission. After all, no one could question the outward success of the games or Harry's dedication to the athletes. The turning point, as we now know, came when Dominic Reed began a more in-depth audit of the financial records. As CEO, Reed was tasked with ensuring transparency and accountability, a responsibility that gained increasing urgency as the scale of donations grew. At first, the discrepancies appeared minor, a mismatched ledger entry here, a delayed payment there. But as Reed and his team dug deeper, a pattern began to emerge. Transactions labeled under vague or innocuous headings, offshore accounts that were difficult to trace, and sums that appeared out of proportion to the costs of the events themselves. Each layer of financial data peeled back revealed new anomalies, suggesting not just oversight, but potential intentional misdirection. The emotional impact on the employees and board members was profound. Many of them had invested years into building the charity, motivated by a belief in its mission and trust in Harry's leadership. To learn that funds might have been diverted was both disillusioning and distressing. Staff members recounted late-night meetings, debates over unexplained payments, and a growing sense of unease. For some, the realization was devastating. They had worked tirelessly to support wounded veterans, and now, the very money that was meant to fund essential programs appeared to have been siphoned for personal gain. Meanwhile, Harry's public image remained untarnished for a time. The narrative presented to the public was one of continued excellence. The Games succeeded, athletes thrived, and sponsorships flourished. Media outlets were captivated by the spectacle and the human interest stories, leaving little room to question the integrity of the financial operations. It was a carefully maintained dichotomy. The public-facing heroism of Harry as the empathetic royal, contrasted with a financial reality that few outside the organization could see. This duality set the stage for the shockwave that would come once Dominic Reed's audit became public knowledge. It was in this environment of secrecy and trust that the alleged financial misconduct took root. The offshore accounts, cloaked behind intermediary companies, allowed funds to move with minimal scrutiny. Transfers described as consultancy fees or event planning services appeared legitimate on paper, yet their destinations raised serious questions. Forensic accountants brought in to analyze the records noted that the complexity of the transactions went far beyond standard charitable financial management. Multiple jurisdictions, layered ownership structures, and vague documentation suggested deliberate obfuscation. The question was no longer whether mistakes had occurred, but whether there had been intent to divert funds. As these revelations slowly leaked into the public sphere, a growing tension emerged. Veteran advocacy groups, initially supportive of Harry, began to express concern. Social media campaigns raised awareness of the financial discrepancies, asking pointed questions about accountability. Legal experts began speculating about potential charges, including embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of charitable funds. Every new report amplified the sense of scandal, painting a picture of a royal figure whose private financial maneuvers threatened to eclipse decades of humanitarian work. By the end of this chapter, the audience is left with a layered understanding of Prince Harry's dual persona, the celebrated royal humanitarian and the figure entangled in increasingly complex financial allegations. The groundwork has been laid for deeper exploration into the mechanics of the alleged misappropriation, the human impact on the veterans and staff, and the unfolding legal and media fallout. The stakes are clear. This is not just a story of money. It is a story of trust, responsibility, and the consequences when privilege intersects with opportunity. The beginning of the audit seemed routine. Dominic Reed, as CEO of the Invictus Games, had a responsibility to ensure that every penny donated by governments, corporations, and private individuals was accounted for. On paper, it was a standard procedure, a comprehensive review to maintain transparency and maintain the trust of donors and athletes alike. But what started as a procedural task quickly became a deep dive into financial irregularities that would shake the charity to its core. From the first set of ledgers, Reed noticed subtle inconsistencies. Transfers labeled as event consultancy fees seemed unusually high compared to industry standards. Payments to companies registered in offshore jurisdictions had no clear connection to legitimate vendors or contractors. Initially, these anomalies were easy to rationalize as accounting errors or delayed documentation. Yet, as more records were cross-checked, a troubling pattern emerged. It was not merely one or two misplaced entries. The irregularities spanned multiple years, involving millions of pounds. The more Reed examined, the more the discrepancies appeared deliberate. The audit team began mapping the flow of funds. Donations intended for adaptive sports equipment, physiotherapy programs, and logistical support for athletes were being rerouted to intermediary accounts. From these accounts, the money appeared to travel through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies before finally arriving in personal accounts connected to Prince Harry. The sophistication of the setup suggested not just opportunity, but premeditation. Each step was carefully disguised as legitimate operational expense, from event consultancy fees to management overheads, creating a veneer of legitimacy that initially fooled both staff and auditors. As Reed and his team dug deeper, they uncovered instances where invoices were duplicated, amounts inflated, or entirely fabricated. For example, payments for transportation and lodging were often billed at several times the actual cost. Vendors listed as providing specialized services either did not exist or were shell entities registered in tax havens. In many cases, the auditors could trace the money as it moved from the charity's operational accounts to offshore accounts in jurisdictions known for financial secrecy. Each discovery added a layer of urgency, highlighting the potential scale of the alleged misappropriation. The emotional toll on the audit team was significant. These were professionals who believed in the mission of the Invictus Games, yet they found themselves uncovering what appeared to be a betrayal at the highest level. Late nights were spent cross-referencing bank statements, tracking payments, and analyzing corporate records from multiple countries. Phone calls with legal and financial experts revealed the complexity and potential consequences of the findings. Each discussion emphasized the gravity of the situation. Misappropriation of charitable funds is not a simple regulatory violation. It is a criminal offense with far-reaching implications. Reed faced a dilemma. Reporting these findings to the board could provoke public scandal, potentially undermining years of goodwill built around the games. Yet, hiding the information would compound the ethical breach. Transparency and accountability were non-negotiable principles, and as CEO, he carried the responsibility of safeguarding the charity's integrity. Carefully, he compiled a comprehensive report, documenting every transaction, every offshore account, and every irregular invoice. The report included visual charts showing the flow of funds, annotated explanations of suspicious activity, and preliminary legal assessments of potential wrongdoing. When the report reached the board of directors, the atmosphere was tense. Many members had been loyal to Harry, inspired by his personal commitment to the athletes and the games. Seeing a detailed account of financial manipulations that allegedly benefited him personally was a shock. The board debated the findings in exhaustive sessions, weighing reputational risk against ethical obligation. Questions were raised. How could such sophisticated schemes be orchestrated without detection for so long? Were there internal controls that failed? Could the public relations impact of exposing a royal figure be managed responsibly? While the board deliberated, word of the audit's preliminary findings began to leak. Journalists, financial analysts, and insiders within the charity started piecing together fragments of information. The narrative began shifting in the public sphere from celebration of the Invictus Games to concern over potential misuse of funds. Social media amplified the story, with speculation ranging from administrative negligence to intentional fraud. Public opinion began to waver, and pressure mounted for official statements and legal investigations. The technical discoveries were staggering. Over several fiscal years, it appeared that millions of pounds had been diverted. Transfers marked as consultancy fees totaled sums that could cover multiple athlete rehabilitation programs. Offshore accounts were structured through layers of trusts and corporate entities, making tracing ownership exceptionally difficult. Auditors noted that the complexity went far beyond typical mismanagement or oversight, suggesting intentional concealment. Experts brought in to review the findings indicated that if proven in court, such actions could constitute serious financial crimes, including embezzlement and fraud. The human element added weight to the narrative. Staff who had worked closely with Harry recalled moments where he insisted on personally approving certain expenses, sometimes bypassing standard procedures. They remembered his charisma, the way he inspired loyalty, and how difficult it was to question his decisions at the time. Now, these same employees grappled with disbelief and disillusionment, realizing that the very person they admired might have been exploiting their trust. For many, the sense of betrayal was as significant as the potential financial loss, highlighting the emotional complexity behind the numbers. As the audit progressed, Dominic Reed made the strategic decision to inform law enforcement. The evidence compiled was too extensive and serious to be addressed internally alone. Contacting the authorities marked a turning point in the story, transforming what had been a contained organizational issue into a public legal crisis. Investigators were provided with detailed documentation, including transactional records, offshore account details, and expert analyses. The stage was set for a confrontation that would pit a royal figure against the mechanisms of law and accountability, a scenario that had rarely been witnessed on such a high-profile scale. The revelation of the audit's findings sent shockwaves across the charitable, legal, and media landscapes. Veteran advocacy groups expressed outrage, donors demanded explanations, and journalists sought every angle of the story. Social media campaigns erupted, with hashtags questioning Harry's integrity trending worldwide. The dichotomy between his public persona as a compassionate advocate and the alleged financial misconduct created a narrative tension that captured global attention. It was no longer a question of whether the funds were mismanaged, but why such actions had occurred and what consequences would follow. By the end of this chapter, the foundation of the scandal is firmly established. The audience is left with a clear understanding of the investigative process, the evidence that exposed potential wrongdoing, and the human and institutional reactions that followed. The tension is palpable. The Invictus Games, a symbol of resilience and honor, is now intertwined with allegations that could redefine public perception of one of the world's most prominent young royals. The chapter closes on a cliffhanger, leading naturally into the next section, which will delve into the specific mechanisms of financial misdirection, the role of offshore accounts, and the reactions of legal experts, setting the stage for the eventual arrest and public fallout surrounding Prince Harry. The complexity of the financial web created by Prince Harry became immediately apparent as investigators and auditors began dissecting every transaction linked to the Invictus Games. What might have appeared to an outsider as ordinary payments for services, event organization, and management fees revealed themselves to be part of a meticulously constructed network of offshore accounts, shell companies, and seemingly innocuous invoices. The sophistication of the scheme suggested not just opportunism, but a calculated and deliberate effort to redirect charitable funds for personal gain. The first step in untangling the web was to map the flow of money from the point of donation to its final destinations. Contributions to the Invictus Games came from multiple sources: government grants, corporate sponsors, private donors, and large philanthropic foundations. In total, tens of millions of pounds flowed into the charity annually, earmarked for adaptive sports, rehabilitation programs for injured veterans, and events designed to raise awareness of the sacrifices made by servicemen and women. These funds were intended to support athletes physically, emotionally, and financially, ensuring that every penny reached the people who relied on the charity's programs. However, the audit revealed that a significant portion of these donations never made it to their intended beneficiaries. Instead, funds were diverted at multiple points. Transfers categorized as event consultancy fees were one of the primary mechanisms for this redirection. Normally, consultancy fees are standard in large-scale event planning, covering expert advice, logistics coordination, and program development. In this case, however, the amounts were suspiciously high, with invoices far exceeding typical market rates. These inflated fees were then funneled into accounts registered in jurisdictions with stringent banking secrecy laws, including the Cayman Islands, Jersey, and Gibraltar. Offshore accounts became the central tool in obscuring the trail. They were structured through layers of trusts, limited companies, and holding entities, each with opaque ownership structures. To an untrained eye, the transactions appeared routine, but forensic accountants could trace the subtle movements. Money leaving the charity's accounts, passing through a shell company, and eventually landing in accounts tied to Prince Harry personally. Every transaction was carefully labeled to appear legitimate. Some were described as payments for marketing, while others were tagged as operational expenses, creating a veil of normalcy that initially concealed the diversion of millions. Auditors noticed patterns that indicated intentional design. For instance, certain transfers were timed to coincide with high-profile events, such as the opening of a new training facility or the announcement of the Invictus Games schedule. By aligning these transactions with periods of intense public attention, the risk of scrutiny appeared minimized. Additionally, complex multi-currency transactions were employed, often converting donations from pounds to euros, then to US dollars, and back again. This not only complicated the accounting, but also allowed for the exploitation of international banking regulations, which can vary dramatically from one jurisdiction to another. A key element of the investigation involved cross-referencing invoices with actual services rendered. In many cases, services were either exaggerated or entirely fictitious. Payments were issued for consulting services from companies that had no employees, no office space, and no operational history. Some of these entities were registered in virtual offices with no physical presence, effectively serving as conduits to launder money from the charity's accounts into private hands. In other cases, companies claimed to provide logistical support for athlete programs, yet no evidence existed of the events or services billed. This discrepancy highlighted the deliberate effort to fabricate financial activity as a cover for personal enrichment. The audit team also uncovered duplicate invoices and overbilling practices. For example, a single event might be billed multiple times under different names or for separate line items, each inflating the total cost. When combined with offshore routing, these practices made it extraordinarily difficult to detect irregularities without detailed scrutiny. Experts likened the approach to a financial maze, designed to mislead auditors and mask the ultimate destination of funds. Each layer added a new level of complexity, ensuring that even experienced accountants could struggle to trace the flow without specialized tools and significant time investment. The psychological toll on the investigators was significant. They were confronting evidence that suggested someone they had admired for charity work could have been exploiting the very people they claimed to support. The duality between public image and alleged private actions became a constant point of discussion, both within the audit team and in preliminary legal consultations. Colleagues expressed disbelief, recalling Harry's passionate speeches, hands-on involvement with athletes, and public appearances where he emphasized the importance of integrity and accountability. Reconciling those public displays with the financial findings proved emotionally challenging. As the money trail became clearer, legal experts emphasized the potential consequences. Misappropriation of charitable funds is considered a serious crime in nearly every jurisdiction involved. The use of offshore accounts and shell companies to hide funds only intensified the gravity, as it suggested intent to conceal illicit activity. The implications extended beyond regulatory penalties. Criminal prosecution was a real possibility. Lawyers involved in the investigation also raised questions about the potential exposure of third parties, including accountants, advisors, and corporate entities, who might have facilitated or ignored suspicious activities. The international dimension of the financial network further complicated the case. Because funds moved across multiple countries, each with its own banking regulations, investigators had to coordinate with authorities abroad. Requests for information had to navigate complex legal frameworks, often delayed by bureaucratic processes or the need to respect sovereign financial privacy laws. Despite these obstacles, persistence yielded results. Banks provided transaction histories, corporate registries revealed ownership details, and experts in anti-money laundering worked tirelessly to piece together a coherent picture of the fund's journey. While the auditors focused on tracing the money, public reaction began to intensify. Media outlets highlighted snippets of the investigation, framing the story around a royal figure potentially misusing millions intended for veterans. Social media commentary exploded, mixing shock, outrage, and speculation. Public interest in the Invictus Games shifted dramatically, from admiration for Harry's personal commitment to concern over whether the charity's mission had been compromised. Donors questioned whether their contributions had truly reached the intended recipients, adding urgency to the ongoing investigation. By the end of this chapter, the intricacies of the money trail were fully revealed. The audience gains a clear understanding of how donations intended for charitable purposes were allegedly redirected, the sophisticated methods used to conceal the transfers, and the emotional and legal stakes involved. Tension escalates as the next chapter promises to explore the personal implications for Harry, the reactions of the royal family, and the initial steps leading toward his eventual arrest. The groundwork is laid for an exploration of both the legal consequences and the profound personal fallout from the scandal. The revelations from the financial investigation did not remain confined to auditors, legal teams, or the media. Inside the hallowed halls of the palace, whispers began circulating, muted at first, then growing in urgency and alarm. Courtiers, advisors, and staff members who had long observed Prince Harry's public and private life started piecing together a troubling picture. What began as discreet conversations in private corridors soon escalated into serious discussions at formal briefings, as the implications of the misappropriated charity funds became undeniable. The palace operates on a delicate balance of image, protocol, and discretion. Every public appearance, speech, or engagement is meticulously planned, often months in advance. Reputation is not just a personal matter but a national concern, tied intimately to the institution's legitimacy and influence. The prospect that one of its most prominent members, someone celebrated for founding and leading a charitable initiative, might be implicated in criminal financial activity sent shockwaves through the inner circles. Those who had been closest to Harry in official capacities felt an immediate tension, caught between loyalty, duty, and moral responsibility. Initial reactions were measured, reflective of the palace's long-standing culture of restraint. Advisors recommended careful observation, urging that no statements be made to the public until a full understanding of the legal evidence was secured. Yet, behind closed doors, emotions ran high. Some were incredulous, struggling to reconcile the Harry they knew, the compassionate, energetic, and committed prince, with the image emerging from the investigation. Others were frustrated, sensing that the actions of a single individual could tarnish years of collective work, damage charitable credibility, and erode public trust. The private meetings that followed were tense, with key figures debating how to handle the crisis. Discussions involved not only legal implications, but also the potential media fallout and the reactions of both domestic and international audiences. Questions abounded. How much should be revealed? Should there be preemptive statements? How would this affect ongoing royal engagements, patronages, and public perception? Advisors reminded each other that, in the digital age, information could not be contained. Even a whisper could become a headline, and any delay could be interpreted as complicity. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. Prince William, Harry's elder brother, was reportedly deeply disturbed. Privately, he expressed feelings of betrayal and disappointment. Having spent decades cultivating a public image of responsibility, duty, and service, he saw the potential scandal as a threat not just to Harry but to the monarchy as a whole. Their relationship, already strained by personal differences, now faced the weight of public controversy. Conversations between the brothers reportedly oscillated between attempts at reasoned counsel and emotionally charged confrontations, with William urging caution and reflection, and Harry alternating between defensiveness and denial. Queen Elizabeth, though aging and often removed from day-to-day operations, was not immune to the gravity of the situation. Her advisors briefed her in detail, highlighting the undeniable evidence emerging from the audit and the potential criminal ramifications. Known for her commitment to duty and the protection of the monarchy's integrity, she reportedly viewed the situation with a mix of sorrow and stern resolve. It was a personal and institutional dilemma: how to address the alleged actions of a grandson without triggering wider instability or compromising decades of carefully maintained respect and authority. As discussions continued, palace staff began noticing subtle shifts in protocol and behavior. Security measures intensified around Harry, ostensibly standard for high-profile figures, but observers sensed additional layers of oversight. Meetings once scheduled with informal ease now required multiple approvals. Advisors who previously offered guidance freely were now consulting legal teams before speaking. Even minor engagements, such as public appearances or charitable events, were scrutinized for potential risk of public exposure or misinterpretation. The tension was palpable, a quiet but unrelenting pressure on everyone in the immediate circle. Meanwhile, leaks to the press began to surface. Unnamed sources described internal concerns and urgent consultations regarding the finances of the Invictus Games. These fragments, while vague, created a ripple effect in public discourse, prompting speculation and analysis from journalists and social commentators. Every public appearance by Harry was dissected, every statement he made scrutinized for tone, hesitation, or subtle signs of guilt. Social media amplified the uncertainty, with hashtags, opinion threads, and viral clips fueling a sense of crisis. The palace had to navigate carefully, balancing the need for privacy with the reality of global attention. Amid this tension, some staff members expressed sympathy for Harry, emphasizing his decades-long commitment to charitable causes and suggesting that lapses in judgment, rather than deliberate malfeasance, might explain the financial discrepancies. Others were less forgiving, pointing to the sophistication and deliberate structuring of the offshore accounts as evidence that this was not mere error but intentional concealment. These divergent views underscored the complexity of the situation. The same actions could be interpreted in drastically different ways, depending on perspective, knowledge, and proximity to the events. As the days progressed, the palace faced increasingly difficult decisions. Should they issue a public statement acknowledging the investigation? Should Harry continue to represent royal initiatives? Or should his duties be temporarily suspended? How would other members of the family respond publicly and privately? These questions were not merely hypothetical. Each decision carried significant risk, with potential legal, social, and political consequences. Advisors emphasized that the narrative could not be allowed to spin out of control, lest public trust erode further and the monarchy face irreparable damage. In the midst of these deliberations, Harry's personal life became a focal point. Close confidants reported that he was struggling with stress, anxiety, and a growing sense of isolation. The contrast between his public persona, charismatic, engaged, and admired, and his private reality, under scrutiny, potentially facing criminal investigation and increasingly distanced from family, was stark. Interviews with friends and associates later revealed a mixture of frustration, regret, and defensiveness, suggesting that he understood the severity of the situation but also felt misunderstood, unfairly targeted, or betrayed by those closest to him. The chapter closed with an air of suspense and uncertainty. Inside the palace walls, the investigation had transformed from a financial audit into a matter that touched on family loyalty, institutional integrity, and public perception. The pressure was mounting on every side: legal authorities, the media, the public, and the royal family itself. Every action, every decision, and every statement carried consequences that could reverberate for years. The stage was set for the next phase of the scandal, as the investigation moved closer to revealing its full implications and the personal and legal fallout began to take shape. The Invictus Games audit was unlike any financial review previously conducted within royal-affiliated charities. For years, the organization had been celebrated for its transparency, high-profile backing, and commitment to veterans. Donors, both private and governmental, had entrusted millions of pounds to ensure wounded servicemen and women could access rehabilitation, sporting opportunities, and vital support services. The sudden revelation that large sums had been redirected into private offshore accounts was a shock that reverberated across every level of the organization and beyond. The process began quietly, with auditors carefully examining bank statements, invoices, and receipts dating back several years. At first, the discrepancies appeared minor, easily explainable by human error or administrative oversight. But as the team delved deeper, a more troubling pattern emerged: substantial consultancy fees paid to entities controlled by Prince Harry himself. Each transaction was meticulously coded in the ledgers, disguised to appear legitimate, and strategically routed through multiple international accounts to evade immediate detection. The sophistication of the financial maneuvering indicated that this was not an accident. Forensic accountants noted repeated patterns of intentional structuring. Small, incremental transfers initially masked the movement of larger sums. Each offshore account was linked to a shell company, registered in jurisdictions known for limited transparency. The accountants discovered that money meant to fund accommodations, medical equipment, and event logistics had instead been funneled toward luxury personal expenses, designer clothing, private jets, high-end vehicles, and extravagant properties. What made the discovery even more shocking was the dual nature of Harry's public persona and private actions. On stage, during Invictus Games ceremonies, he had consistently emphasized selflessness, dedication, and service to the veteran community. Speeches praised sacrifice, resilience, and the importance of channeling personal ambition into helping others. Behind the scenes, the audit revealed a starkly different reality. Funds intended to support the very people he claimed to champion had been diverted for personal enrichment. The stark contrast between public image and private behavior ignited outrage among both staff and supporters. Initial meetings between the audit team and Invictus Games leadership were tense. Dominic Reed, the CEO, demanded complete transparency, insisting on a full review of every transaction, every account, and every invoice linked to Harry. The auditors, aware of the high-profile nature of their findings, proceeded cautiously, documenting every step meticulously to withstand potential legal scrutiny. Each report, spreadsheet, and financial model was backed by verifiable evidence, digital trails, timestamps, and cross-references that could not be easily dismissed. As the review progressed, the scale of the misappropriation became evident. Millions of pounds had been redirected over several years, often through multiple intermediary accounts and shell companies designed to obscure the ultimate beneficiary. Some transfers coincided with high-profile events or charitable campaigns, creating an illusion of normal operational expenditure while the funds quietly vanished from the charity's legitimate budgets. Auditors noted that the misappropriations were not sporadic mistakes, but part of a calculated strategy to exploit the organization's reputation for personal gain. Legal advisors were brought in early to evaluate the potential ramifications. Discussions centered not only on the immediate financial implications, but also on criminal liability. In the UK, charities operate under strict regulatory oversight, and misappropriation of funds constitutes a serious offense. The advisors emphasized that the combination of deliberate concealment, offshore accounts, and personal enrichment left little room for defense. If proven in court, these actions could result in significant prison time, fines, and permanent damage to public credibility. The human element of the audit also became painfully apparent. Staff members, many of whom had dedicated years of service to the charity, were shocked to learn that funds earmarked for veterans' recovery had been redirected. Accounts of missed opportunities, delayed equipment deliveries, and underfunded programs were juxtaposed with Harry's extravagant personal expenditures. Emotional testimony from employees underscored the sense of betrayal. Some described sleepless nights, moral conflict, and even resentment toward leadership, questioning how a figure so publicly lauded for service could exploit the very cause he championed. Media outlets, already sensitive to stories involving the royal family, began picking up fragments of the audit findings. Leaks from anonymous sources hinted at irregularities, sparking a frenzy of speculation. Journalists with experience covering royal finances interpreted the emerging pattern as both shocking and unprecedented. Public reaction was immediate. Social media exploded with discussion, outrage, and incredulity. Hashtags condemning mismanagement, corruption, and hypocrisy trended globally. Donors demanded explanations, while critics of the monarchy framed the revelations as evidence of systemic failure. Amid the chaos, Dominic Reed faced the delicate task of balancing transparency with discretion. On one hand, the charity's integrity depended on full disclosure of the findings. On the other, the high-profile nature of the case required careful navigation to avoid unintended legal complications or reputational harm. Reed's strategy was methodical. Every statement to the press was vetted by legal teams, every disclosure to stakeholders was documented, and every action aimed to maintain credibility while ensuring accountability. His approach underscored a commitment to the mission of the charity and a recognition of the gravity of the situation. The auditor's reports, once finalized, painted a comprehensive and undeniable picture of financial mismanagement. Each misappropriation was documented with precise amounts, dates, and corresponding transactions. Evidence demonstrated that the funds were intentionally diverted to private accounts controlled by Harry, often labeled in ways designed to appear legitimate. The reports also included analyses of potential motives, highlighting a pattern of lifestyle maintenance, luxury acquisitions, and personal enrichment that directly contradicted the principles of the Invictus Games. Legal authorities, upon reviewing the audit findings, moved swiftly. Investigations were launched into both the financial transactions and the broader governance of the charity. Subpoenas were issued, bank accounts frozen, and forensic teams deployed to track every dollar transferred through the network of offshore entities. The scale and sophistication of the financial misappropriation made this one of the most high-profile cases involving royal charity finances in recent history. Public opinion, meanwhile, reached a fever pitch. Editorials criticized not only the alleged misappropriation, but also the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed it to occur. Analysts debated how much of the situation reflected personal failure versus institutional oversight. Donors, veterans, and members of the public demanded accountability, and pressure mounted on both the charity and the royal family to respond decisively. Harry, once celebrated for his charitable initiatives, now faced scrutiny, criticism, and legal jeopardy. The audit's uncovering of financial misdeeds was more than just a technical revelation. It represented a turning point. What had begun as a quiet examination of ledgers and invoices had erupted into a scandal that implicated personal ethics, public trust, and institutional integrity. The implications extended far beyond monetary loss. They touched on the credibility of the royal family, the legitimacy of charitable work, and the moral expectations placed on public figures. By the time the audit was complete, the findings left no room for ambiguity. The evidence was clear, detailed, and compelling. Funds intended to support injured veterans had been redirected to personal enrichment, transactions had been concealed through complex financial structures, and the actions demonstrated both premeditation and awareness. The stage was set for public disclosure, legal proceedings, and intense media scrutiny, each element threatening to reshape the narrative of Prince Harry's legacy forever. The revelation of financial misconduct within the Invictus Games sent shockwaves through multiple spheres: charity, royalty, and the global public. For decades, Prince Harry had cultivated an image of a committed advocate for veterans, a philanthropist who used his high profile to raise awareness and funding for those injured in service. The stark contrast between his public persona and the findings of the audit created a storm of outrage and disbelief that quickly escalated beyond the charity itself. Immediately after the audit findings were made known to the board, emergency meetings were convened. Dominic Reed, facing a moment of profound responsibility, called together senior leadership, legal advisors, and auditors to discuss the next steps. The atmosphere in the boardroom was tense, with the weight of responsibility palpable. The executives understood that the implications of the audit went beyond internal accountability. It had become a matter of public trust, legal obligation, and moral responsibility. The first wave of the fallout targeted public perception. News of the diverted funds spread rapidly through global media outlets, amplified by social media platforms where millions reacted with shock, anger, and disbelief. Headlines screamed of betrayal, mismanagement, and scandal, casting a shadow not only over the charity, but also over Harry's reputation and, by extension, the royal family. Memes circulated depicting lavish lifestyles juxtaposed against underfunded veteran programs, and public commentary ranged from disbelief to condemnation. Supporters who had once lauded his philanthropic endeavors felt betrayed, questioning how someone so publicly committed to service could exploit the very people he promised to help. Simultaneously, legal authorities moved with precision and urgency. Given the scale of the financial irregularities and the clear evidence of deliberate misappropriation, investigators prepared to execute search warrants, freeze accounts, and issue subpoenas to parties connected to the transactions. Investigative teams from multiple jurisdictions, including the UK and international financial hubs where the offshore accounts were registered, collaborated to trace the flow of funds. Each movement of money was meticulously documented, linking back to shell companies and accounts under Harry's control. Legal experts emphasized that the sophistication of the financial maneuvers indicated intent, a factor that greatly increased the likelihood of criminal charges. On the day the arrest was carried out, media coverage reached a fever pitch. Cameras lined the streets outside the residence where authorities were authorized to detain Harry, and reporters speculated endlessly about potential outcomes. Statements from the police emphasized that the action was based on solid evidence and standard procedures, but the high-profile nature of the case turned routine law enforcement into a spectacle watched by millions worldwide. The arrest itself was conducted swiftly, professionally, and without incident, but the optics were undeniable. A senior royal figure was now facing legal scrutiny for serious financial misconduct. The immediate impact on the Invictus Games was profound. Donors expressed anger and dismay, with several large contributions put on hold pending clarification and restitution. Veteran participants and staff members, who had dedicated themselves to the organization's mission, felt a mixture of betrayal and concern for the future. Programs were temporarily suspended, events postponed, and communications carefully managed to maintain credibility while the legal process unfolded. Dominic Reed and his team faced the delicate task of reassuring stakeholders while navigating an unprecedented crisis. Within royal circles, the fallout triggered intense private deliberations. Advisors, aides, and family members worked behind closed doors to assess the potential ramifications. Discussions centered on public messaging, legal defense, and the broader implications for the monarchy's image. The scandal created a tension between loyalty, public responsibility, and the need for transparency. The royal family, accustomed to managing crises, now faced a scenario that blended personal accountability, legal exposure, and a rapidly shifting media landscape. Public sentiment, meanwhile, was polarized. Some defended Harry, emphasizing his prior charitable work and questioning whether the entire situation had been exaggerated by media sensationalism. Others condemned him, citing the deliberate and systematic nature of the misappropriation, emphasizing that even high-profile figures are not above the law. Social media debates raged, with hashtags trending worldwide that called for justice, restitution, and accountability. Influencers, journalists, and commentators analyzed the audit findings, dissecting each transaction and highlighting the contrast between Harry's statements and actions. Forensic accountants continued their work, providing detailed testimony and expert analysis that would become central in court proceedings. Each invoice, transaction record, and bank statement was scrutinized, illustrating a pattern of mismanagement that left little room for interpretation. The evidence demonstrated not only the misdirection of funds, but also the deliberate effort to conceal those actions, including falsified documents, layered transfers, and strategic timing to coincide with charitable events. The comprehensive nature of the audit meant that any legal challenge would face significant obstacles. As the legal process unfolded, Harry's personal and professional life experienced immense strain. Travel restrictions, security considerations, and public scrutiny created a pressure cooker environment. Interviews, public appearances, and engagements were canceled or postponed. Advisors worked tirelessly to prepare legal defenses while managing communications with the media. The arrest, while professionally executed, marked a turning point. The private sphere of royal activity had been irrevocably transformed into a public legal theater. Meanwhile, the veterans and staff affected by the misappropriation grappled with both practical and emotional consequences. Programs were delayed, medical and rehabilitation services impacted, and the trust built over years of engagement felt shattered. Internal communications emphasized transparency, accountability, and corrective measures, but the damage to morale and faith in leadership was evident. For some, the revelation prompted reflection on the vulnerability of charitable institutions and the importance of rigorous oversight. Internationally, the scandal reverberated beyond the UK. Charitable organizations and watchdog groups analyzed the case as a cautionary tale of governance failure. Financial regulatory bodies examined similar structures within other organizations, seeking to prevent comparable misconduct. Donors and supporters worldwide reconsidered their contributions, weighing the risks of entrusting funds to entities, even well-regarded ones, without sufficient oversight. The case became a reference point for discussions about accountability, transparency, and ethical responsibility in high-profile charitable endeavors. For Harry personally, the arrest represented both a legal and emotional crucible. Privately, he faced questions about motivation, judgment, and the choices that had led to this point. Publicly, the optics were stark, a figure once celebrated for commitment to service, now facing allegations of deliberate financial misconduct. The narrative, amplified by media coverage, presented a dramatic inversion of expectation, challenging long-held perceptions and forcing a reconsideration of character and legacy. The immediate legal consequences were severe. Bail conditions were set, preliminary hearings scheduled, and evidence formally submitted to the courts. Lawyers presented arguments about intent, governance responsibility, and mitigating circumstances, while prosecutors highlighted the meticulous documentation and the deliberate concealment of funds. Every element of the audit was scrutinized under the lens of criminal law, and each party prepared for what promised to be a prolonged and highly publicized legal battle. Amidst the legal and media storm, Dominic Reed and the Invictus Games leadership took decisive steps to restore credibility and stabilize operations. New governance protocols were instituted, independent oversight boards formed, and full transparency committed to stakeholders. These measures aimed not only to recover public trust, but also to ensure that the veterans, the core beneficiaries of the charity, would continue to receive essential services without further disruption. The arrest of a royal figure for misappropriation of charity funds was unprecedented in scale and impact. The convergence of high-profile public image, deliberate financial misconduct, and media scrutiny created a scenario in which legal, personal, and institutional consequences intertwined. Public discourse was intense, legal processes meticulous, and the reputational damage extensive. The chapter closed with the unmistakable reality that accountability, regardless of status, had begun, and that the story of the Invictus Games and Prince Harry would never be the same. The arrest of Prince Harry over the misappropriation of Invictus Games funds did not exist in isolation. Within hours of the news breaking, ripples extended throughout Buckingham Palace, reverberating across royal circles, government offices, and public consciousness. The monarchy, often viewed as a symbol of stability, tradition, and duty, suddenly faced a scenario that threatened its carefully curated image. Advisors, aides, and senior palace staff convened urgent meetings to assess potential responses, weighing legal realities, public perception, and the preservation of institutional credibility. The stakes were high, and the decisions made in those hours would shape not only Harry's fate, but also the future relationship between the royal family and the public. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was one of intense concern. Courtiers, accustomed to managing controversies ranging from diplomatic missteps to personal scandals, quickly recognized that this case was different in magnitude and scope. The involvement of legal authorities in prosecuting a senior royal for financial crimes was unprecedented in modern history. Discussions focused on strategy, how to publicly acknowledge the gravity of the situation without further inflaming public anger, how to support affected family members, and how to reinforce the monarchy's commitment to accountability. Every word, every gesture, every public statement had to be meticulously calculated, as any misstep could intensify media scrutiny and public skepticism. Media outlets worldwide immediately picked up the story, framing it as a clash between royal privilege and legal accountability. Headlines from London to New York emphasized the shock and betrayal, often highlighting the contrast between Harry's philanthropic reputation and the stark evidence of misconduct. Opinion pieces dissected each transaction, scrutinized his public statements over the years, and debated the implications for both the monarchy and the charitable sector. Social media platforms became arenas for intense debate, with millions expressing outrage, disappointment, and disbelief. Hashtags questioning trust, ethics, and accountability trended within hours, turning public sentiment into a digital tidal wave that demanded immediate attention. Public reaction was raw and visceral. Supporters who had championed Harry's charitable initiatives felt blindsided, struggling to reconcile the man they admired with the evidence of deliberate financial mismanagement. Veterans and beneficiaries of the Invictus Games expressed profound disappointment, anger, and betrayal. Emotional testimonials surfaced, some recounting how the redirected funds had compromised vital rehabilitation programs, delayed essential medical equipment, and diminished resources for families of injured service members. The human cost of the misappropriation became a central theme, amplifying outrage and giving the scandal a deeply personal dimension that extended beyond financial loss. Within the royal family, private deliberations intensified. King Charles III, previously engaged in various global and charitable initiatives, now faced the dual challenge of preserving institutional integrity while navigating familial loyalty. Advisors debated the appropriate public stance, whether to issue a formal statement, what tone to adopt, and how to balance transparency with the protection of the family's reputation. The dilemma was complicated further by the interconnectedness of personal and public roles. Decisions about Harry's titles, privileges, and future engagements were no longer abstract considerations. They had become urgent measures with immediate political, legal, and social implications. Political figures, too, weighed in on the scandal. Members of Parliament, particularly those on committees overseeing charitable organizations and financial oversight, issued statements calling for full transparency, rigorous accountability, and reform. Critics questioned the effectiveness of existing safeguards and highlighted the risks associated with high-profile charitable operations that involved both public funds and celebrity influence. The case sparked a broader debate about governance in charitable institutions, the ethical responsibilities of prominent public figures, and the consequences of exploiting positions of trust for personal gain. Meanwhile, royal advisors began to consider potential repercussions for Harry's future within the monarchy. Discussions explored whether he could retain certain ceremonial roles, how public appearances should be managed, and the implications for international engagements where he represented the crown. There was an acute awareness that the scandal could erode public trust in the monarchy at large, and that corrective action was essential to prevent long-term reputational damage. Contingency plans were drafted, including temporary withdrawal from official duties, suspension of privileges, and potential reassignment of charitable responsibilities to other family members. Each scenario required careful legal consultation, media strategy, and public messaging to maintain credibility while addressing the seriousness of the charges. The scandal also had profound implications for Harry's immediate family. Meghan Markle, already navigating complex media scrutiny, faced intense public attention and criticism, despite not being directly implicated in the misappropriation. The couple's children were shielded as much as possible, yet the pervasive media coverage created unavoidable challenges. Courtiers and security advisors implemented additional protective measures to maintain privacy and minimize exposure to the sensationalized reporting that dominated headlines. The family's personal lives became intertwined with public judgment, intensifying the emotional strain of an already high-pressure situation. Public discourse extended beyond scandal into moral and ethical debate. Media analysts, social commentators, and members of the general public engaged in discussions about accountability, integrity, and the responsibility of individuals in positions of power. Debates frequently centered on questions of privilege, how systemic advantages may enable misconduct, whether royal status can or should confer immunity, and how trust is earned and maintained in public-facing institutions. Editorials explored the dissonance between Harry's public narrative of compassion and his alleged financial misconduct, questioning whether fame and influence had been leveraged to obscure wrongdoing. The economic ramifications of the scandal were significant as well. Sponsors and corporate partners connected with the Invictus Games reconsidered their affiliations, suspending funding or demanding assurances of transparency and reform. International donors expressed concern over the security of their contributions, leading to audits, public statements, and renewed scrutiny of financial processes. The potential long-term financial impact threatened not only the continuity of programs, but also the livelihoods and well-being of staff and beneficiaries reliant on consistent funding. The global reaction was compounded by the story's viral nature. Social media platforms amplified every new development, whether court filings, public statements, or commentary from experts and celebrities. Viral posts, memes, and discussions fueled a continuous cycle of scrutiny and speculation, creating a climate in which the narrative was shaped as much by public perception as by verified facts. The sheer velocity of information dissemination meant that any misstep, miscommunication, or delay in response could escalate rapidly, requiring constant vigilance from the royal communications team and legal advisors alike. Legal experts emphasized the seriousness of the charges and the evidence presented. They highlighted that the deliberate concealment of funds, use of offshore accounts, and falsification of documents suggested intent rather than error, significantly increasing the potential for conviction and sentencing. Analysts also noted that the case could set a precedent, demonstrating that even senior members of the royal family are subject to the rule of law, particularly when their actions intersect with public trust and charitable responsibilities. In the midst of public outrage, the palace faced a balancing act, demonstrating accountability without appearing punitive, managing media scrutiny without obstructing due process, and supporting affected family members without compromising legal proceedings. Every public statement was carefully crafted, every engagement reconsidered, and every image projected through the media meticulously managed. The challenge was to maintain a sense of dignity and stability in the face of unprecedented scrutiny and pressure. The scandal's impact on public trust extended beyond Harry himself. Confidence in the Invictus Games, royal charities, and high-profile philanthropic endeavors became intertwined with perceptions of oversight and integrity. The case sparked calls for independent governance, transparent reporting, and ethical accountability across the charitable sector. Advocacy groups, veteran associations, and regulatory bodies emphasized the importance of preventive measures, rigorous auditing, and systemic reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. By the end of the initial public and royal response, the narrative had evolved from shock and disbelief to sustained scrutiny, reflection, and strategic action. Harry's arrest, initially a moment of personal consequence, had escalated into a broader discourse on accountability, privilege, and institutional responsibility. Media coverage continued to intensify, public debate remained fervent, and the palace's response became a central focus of national and international attention. Every decision, statement, and legal maneuver carried weight, shaping not only Harry's fate, but also